So you just picked up your first miniatures, or maybe you painted for a while, and you keep hearing about this thing called the wet palette. Should you keep ignoring these recommendations, or is it time to board the hype train? Today is the day for the ultimate guide to the wet palette. We've all been there, starting out using a regular palette, putting paint on it to figure out that just a few seconds later the paint has already started drying. And with this, making your paint look gloopy and leaving brush strokes on your miniatures. A fun little anecdote, I actually didn't start with one of these. I started with a plain piece of paper, not realizing that paper actually attracts the water and makes the paint dry even faster. Using a wet palette will help you with this, keeping your paint to a perfect consistency over hours and sometimes even days, instead of just a few minutes. There are plenty of ways of using one, and you can make one at home or you can buy one that's specifically made for use of acrylic paints. I will show you how to use one, the do's and don'ts of wet palettes. I will also show you the best way I found of making a wet palette using stuff you have at home, and tell you a little bit about why I bought a professional one and why I won't go back to using a homemade one. Just make sure to stick around to the end, because this video will be packed with meaty information, and at the end I will also be giving away one of these everlasting wet palettes to one of the viewers. Before I start giving you more meaty tips about wet palettes, I need to make a shout out to thank all of the people who decided to support the channel by entering the Patreon campaign and pledging a few dollars to just keep all of this running. Special thanks to our top supporter, Nyström, the My Demonic Little Pony supporter. And also a huge shout out to all of the new supporters from the last week who supported $10 or more, like Roger Hack, Pras Soprano, Vittori Canzani, Victor Westermark, Gabriel McCall, Matthias Payet, Elwin Dias, Tom K301 and Remux. I probably killed all of your names, but thank you so much for joining the Patreon campaign, being new supporters, and thanks everyone else as well who joined the lower tiers. All of you guys are the main reason why I will be able to take a few days every week to just work on this channel, create more hobby content for the world, and just, once again, thank you so much for supporting the channel. So hold tight, let's get started. We start specifically with the don'ts. The first one is quite easy. Don't use metallic paints on your wet palette. Metallic paints has these tiny metal flakes, and these will seep through the parchment papers and contaminate the sponge you have inside of your wet palette. These metal flakes are so tiny that they will spread and contaminate the other paints you have in there, the water that's in the wet palette, and potentially just give you a bad day. All metal paints aren't the same, but it's better to be safe than sorry, and use a regular palette when painting with metal paints. The second don't is washes, inks, and contrast paints are all hydrophilic paints. You goddamn hydrophiliac! And in all honesty, all paints kind of are. That means that the paints are attracted to water. And the contrast paints, the inks and the washes are more so than the regular paints, which means that they seep through your paper just a few minutes after you put them on the palette. This won't ruin your palette anything, but it's just a waste of paint to just put it on the palette, to just realize a few seconds later that it's just gone. So how do you use a wet palette, and why should you use one? The main reason to use one, as I mentioned before, is it will keep your paints moist for a longer time. This will also save you a lot of paint, make it last longer and make you paint faster, and I will tell you why in just a few seconds. Topic number 1. Painting faster, smoother by mixing your paints. So when I paint models, I usually divide them into different areas on the model. So if I'm painting a Space Marine, I start with the armor, or if I'm painting skin, I paint all of the skin at the same time. So what I do is I put all of the paints I'm gonna need to paint this skin or this armor onto the wet palette. This way I got everything I need directly at hand. I won't have to spend any time to open and close bottles, and everything will just be a lot smoother for me. And this way I can also mix the paints directly on the palette, going from one paint to the other without having to hesitate or mix between different pots. I have everything when I need it. If you watched my Untamed Beast painting tutorial, you'll see that I go from using just the base paint to mixing it with the first highlight, and then going to using only the first highlight, and then mixing the first highlight with the second one. And this way Even when I'm painting with layers, I get super smooth transitions because I can mix everything directly how I want it onto the palette. And this is one of the main reasons why the process is quite fast for me, because I have everything at hand and I can mix it quickly to smooth transition. I can also jump between colors and try different things without having to pause and open bottles or switch paints or clean the brush. I have everything when I need it. And the second one is diluting the paints. This is another one of those questions that frequently come up in my feed. Do I dilute my paints? And when I move them to dropper bottles, did I add some flow improver or flow aid to dilute my paints because they don't see me dilute my paints on the palette when I paint? And the answer to this question is simply, most of the time I don't, because I really don't need to when I use the wet palette. And this to me is just one of the strongest ways of using the wet palette. And this is the main reason, if you ask me, why I think you should start using a wet palette to improve your skill quickly. When I have the wet palette, I can control how much paint I have in my brush. So when you have the brush dry, at first you just dip it in some water. You remove any excess of the water in the brush by either wicking it on a piece of paper or on your hand, or as many people do, lick your brush to get the perfect amount of water in your brush. You then control the amount of paint in your brush by dipping just the tip or more of the brush into the paint. You then mix this in by dragging it around on the wet palette and voila! So if you want a glaze, you just take the tip of the brush into the paint and stir it around. If you want more, you just add more of the paint onto the brush before you stir it into the belly of the brush. And you have the perfect dilution in your brush without having to add any flow improver or mix it with water or doing different blends to get these perfect glazes. You can control that on the wet palette. And this might seem difficult to you at first, but trust me, it just takes a few days of practicing and you will have owned this skill quite perfectly. And this is another one of those things that speeds up your painting process, because I can go from a super diluted glaze directly to a thick layer without having to remix my paints. And the third technique that really benefits from using a wet palette is wet blending. Wet blending is another one of those really powerful techniques that speeds up your painting process and makes it more fun to paint. And if you ask me, it's also one of the easiest ways of getting smooth blends. And with that, I'm not saying that it will be easy the first time, but once you've done it a couple of times, you'll see how easy it is to actually get these perfect blends. And wet blending is a technique that a lot of professionals use. The way it works is you have two different paints that you want to make a transition in between. Maybe you want to go from red to orange. To make a wet blend, you just put the first paint on the miniature, and while that paint is still wet, before it dries onto the miniature, you start adding the orange from the other side of the miniature. Because both of the paints are still wet, when they meet with each other in the center, you will have a perfect blend between the red and the orange, and you will have a nice gradient, smooth as butter. And this is wet blending. And when I do wet blends, I just make sure that I have all the paints that I need ready at hand. So I put them all on the wet palette. And examples of these is maybe a cloak that you want painted. You can see here I went from a dark brown to a green in just a matter of seconds. And maybe you're painting a dwarf face and you want the nose to be a bit redder than the rest of the skin. So you just take the red paint and put it on the nose and then start mixing around the edges of the nose. And you can see how fast this process is, and the reason for it is simply because I have everything ready at hand and I can work quickly without stopping, pausing, opening bottles, and yeah, same story goes on for all of these techniques. And as you've seen, all of these techniques have saved me a lot of time while painting, and it also makes it easier for me to try new stuff out and develop faster. I'm going to show you a few more tips and tricks, but first we're going to talk about how to make your own wet palette. So, I've gone through a couple of different homemade wet palettes, and this is the best way I found to make your own wet palette. What you need is parchment papers. You need a container that's airtight, and a plastic one like a Tupperware is perfect. You need some form of sponge or paper towel to contain the water. And when you buy these parchment papers, make sure to not buy wax papers, because when using regular parchment papers, just a tiny bit of water seeps through the paper, so it keeps the paint perfectly moist. If you're using wax paper, none of this water will go through, so it will be like using just a regular palette. And I've seen a lot of people using just regular paper towels, and I've seen people using large sponges, and all of these work, but if you ask me, that's not an optimal wet palette. Out of all the tools I found work best that you have at home, the cellulose sponge cloths are by far the best tool. And these are like a dish rag, but it has the cellulose texture. I don't know if this is the right English name, but the brand we have in Sweden, that's the biggest, is called Vetex, and these dish rugs are perfect because they attract a lot of water, and the amount that they release up through the parchment papers is pretty much the perfect amount. They also have a super flat surface, which means that the parchment papers will lie flat on top of this, and this means that you will have water seeping through the palette evenly throughout the whole wet palette. If you use paper towels, you will have an uneven palette and an uneven flow of water seeping through the parchment papers. I also found it harder to get these paper towels to last long. After a while, the paper just disintegrates into being nothing, while this cellulose will last you forever. So how do you make the wet palette? Well, I'm gonna cover that now. We start with this plastic container. And this is just a container that's airtight, that plastic. It costs like $1 at the food stores here, and you can probably find them at all of your food stores wherever you live. And if you can't, you can use the containers that you get from like the Flock or the Grass Tufts that you buy from Games Workshop. They're a bit smaller, but they work perfectly fine. You then take one of these cellulose dish rags, you then cut them to a perfect size. You want to leave about 10-20 millimeters around all of the dish rag. This is because when you pour in the water, the dish rag will swell and become a bit larger. You don't want the dish rag to go up on the sides of the wet palette, because you will have an uneven surface for your parchment paper, and also this might cause the wet palette to dry up a bit faster. But when you have the perfect fit, you do the same thing with the parchment paper. You want to leave a few millimeters so it doesn't go up on the sides of the wet palette, because this once again will make the airflow and the water evaporation change, so you won't have an as even flow as if it's perfectly flat within all of the edges of the sponge. I strongly recommend you to make a template for one of these and just cut 20-30 of these so you have them ready. Because if you don't, you need to start up by cutting up one of these. It will become a chore and it will stop you from just being able to start painting directly. And you just don't want any roadblocks to stop you from being able to start painting directly, because you have these roadblocks, it will give you an excuse to not paint at all. And just make sure to cut all of your products neatly so you will have an even wet palette and your water won't evaporate faster than it needs to. And another handy tip that you can keep in mind is that if you live in a humid environment, maybe as I do, because I painted my basement and the basement is kind of humid. If you seal your wet palette completely, your paints will become too moist and have too much water in them, so they become almost like a wash overnight. So in a humid environment, you can leave a little bit of the bottle open and not close it completely. And some of the water can leave the wet palette and won't keep everything condensed and just filled with water. But if you live in a dry environment, closing it completely will probably be the way to go. And you will probably see quite quickly what works in your environment, but just using it a few days. And this wet palette, it worked perfectly for me for months and months before I jumped into what we're about to talk about next. Let's talk about what I use today. Probably seen this in all of my painting videos. This is the Everlasting Wet Palette from Redgrass Games. And a full disclaimer, about 9 months ago, way before I started this channel, I ordered this and paid for it with my own money. I am not paid by them to say what I say today or even include it in this video. But with that said, oh my god, do I love this wet palette. I did develop a lot by using the homemade wet palette, but using this one that's specifically made for acrylic paints just opened another door for me. And the devil is really in the details with this one, because it's not a huge difference, but what it does, it just does it perfectly. And for me, like, the biggest thing is just that everything is made for what I'm using it for. So I have a very low edge, so it makes it super easy and ergonomical to just take the paints. It has parchment papers that is specifically made for paints, not for baking, not for whatever. It's made for the paints that are used when painting miniatures. So it has like a perfect seep through of water that comes out through the sponge, up through the paper into the paint. So I just found that the paints just last longer. So it keeps the paint to a more original texture what it has like in the bottle compared to a homemade wet palette. And the same thing goes for the sponge, like it's perfectly cut for this big wet palette, and it just releases the right amount of water and holds the right amount of water. And I don't know what the difference is, what the different materials are, and what's different in the production to make it this good, but it just is, and I'm fine with not knowing exactly why. And I ordered the XL one, which gives me a larger working area. The surface I have is enormous compared to the homemade one, and it's a lot easier for me to have control of the different paint categories, and when I want to go from one paint to another, I have more surface to work on and I can use it longer before I have to switch the paper that's on there. You also have this plastic regular palette with magnets on the side of the palette, and these are just bonuses. To be honest, like the main thing and the reason why I like and why I can recommend it, it just keeps a consistent consistency.
Oh my god, those words sounds fancy.
So when should you buy one of these palettes? If you paint a lot, like a lot, it's a no-brainer, you should buy one. And the same thing if you've been using a homemade one for a while. Like, it's worth the upgrade if you know you use a wet palette. But if you're a beginner, you haven't used a wet palette before, or you're just getting into painting, this is one of these costs that you can wait with for a few months. I mean, sure, it's a nice tool, but you really don't need it to begin with. And the startup costs for new painters are so high that just build one at home with things you have at home. Get used to that one for a few months before you jump on the train of buying an everlasting wet palette. And in retrospect, would I buy this one again? Well, heck yeah, I would. And that's also the main reason why I sent an email to Redgrass Games and asked them to send me one of these that I can give away to you as a viewer. So, if you're already subscribing, the only thing you need to do is hit the like button down below, leave a comment and tell me what miniatures you're painting right now. I'd love to hear what you guys are painting. Is it Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar, maybe it's Zombicide or a bust? Just let me know down below and you have a chance of winning one of these wet palettes. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below as well. And if you're new to this channel, every week I release at least a new video. You can find tons of hobby tips and painting tutorials on my channel. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of it. And with that said, guys, have a great day. Bye.